Hi, my name is Bart. I'm a consumer psychologist, born and raised as a psychologist. My parents are both behavioral scientists. My sister is one. I married one. Half of my company is a psychologist. So I have a huge interest in what drives humanity, what makes us click, and in studying that. And I also have a huge interest in the methods and statistics, experimental designs in trying to find and study human behavior. So I wanna get started with a very old story that my dad used to tell me, and it's a story about a king. I'm from the Netherlands. We live in a kingdom, and I'm going to keep it very short because of the time. But the baseline of his story was that our king, a long time ago, was very good in leading his country because he had three counselors, and he thought about these three counselors very well. These counselors, advisors, one of them he made responsible for getting the right information from his people, right? So just trustworthy information, large enough sample sizes, etc., etc. He called this counselor the data counselor. And then my dad said, when the king knew that the information he got was trustworthy, he wanted to have trustworthy evidence on what would change people's behavior. So he nominated another counselor, and that was the counselor for evidence. And that person was responsible for reliable, high validity type of evidence. And even though that might seem enough, my dad told me when I was young, there's a third counselor that he installed, because when you have evidence, you still need to know where you can apply that evidence. What's the external validity? Can you extrapolate it to other situations, etc.? So here you had these three counselors, and that always stuck to me. So therefore, I made a new presentation, and I'm going to hook it up to these three counselors, and they probably will show you that some of the A/B testing you're doing is not as good as you were hoping. We're still, even the most advanced companies like Facebook and Microsoft are still finding out new issues every day. So that's something for the whole market. But I think I also try to give some tips on how to tackle these and how to mature and make a more and more profitable A/B testing program in the end. So here we go. First of all, and this is where the awkward slides start, I'm very sorry, but imagine a typical case where organization did 150 experiments, right? So they found among these 150 experiments, they found 20% winners. So those are 30 winners. They have a threshold of 90% significance or above, or p-value below 0.1. And they calculate every winner based on the assumption that the winner will have an uplift for at least 6 months, and they get to these figures that the program has been costing 1 million euros or dollars, but the revenue, if you add up all these winning experiments, has been 3 million, which is an ROI of 300%. Right? I come across a lot of organizations where this is basically what is being told to the higher board. So many winners, every winner has a certain uplift, and altogether this is what it is. This is far from what the uplifts will be in reality. And moreover, I find that a lot of organizations, CRO teams, CRO experts also tell a lot about the learnings from the experiments. And of course you learn a lot, but I think the basic thing you learn when you start experimenting with human behavior is that we know very, very little about what drives us as humans and what influences as human beings in our behavior. And although little by little experimentation will explain what actually drives us or what does not drive us, we cannot say that one experiment with one hypothesis has proven the hypothesis. Right? The truth is far from that. We'll get to that later. So the lots of learnings is also something I see a lot. Well, here comes the first counselor, Mr. Data, and he starts questioning whether the data that the experiments were based on was trustworthy, solid enough, was the quality good enough, right? And I come across a lots of A/B tests where we find issues in the fundamental data. This is where why you should always be, right, like continuously be running A test to check whether the fundamental data is correct. So one of the things we come across a lot are sample ratio mismatches. Others are carryover effects when organizations build their own testing tools, especially. And we come across cookie churn type of sample dilution issues. We'll get back to details more later, but normally this already wipes out a large number of the experiments that were done. So let's assume in this case there were another 120 experiments left, so 30 of them we killed because the data was not trustworthy enough. Then the ROI tremendously drops already because the costs are not going down, but the revenues that were found are lower, right? So 300% it used to be, it now only is 240%. Here comes the next counselor. It's Mr. Evidence. And Mr. Evidence makes it even a lot more worse, because when we look honestly at the experimental results from this typical case, we will see that when you have a winner ratio of 20% and you're using a threshold of 90% for significance, then you will have a high amount of false positives, right? False discovery rate. So we have to wipe out a lot of the winning experiments. There are more advanced techniques to tackle this, but let's just say that we wipe out a certain percentage. In this case, there will be 10 winners, which we clear. Those are probably false winners. We don't know which winners, right? I can't tell you it was that or that one, but of all the winners that we had left, 10 of them will, due to statistics, be false positives. There are also a few, usually very little, but false negatives. So those are inconclusive experiments with inconclusive outcomes, which actually in reality will bring growth and uplift, which is a nightmare because that's the worst case scenario, right? We have something that will grow your company, but a test tells you, no, it's inconclusive, it's not going to do anything. So although they are usually less, false negatives and false positives, their impact is way worse. And we also have S-type errors, not so many, hardly any, which is the case when a winner is actually in reality a significant loser. So you are expecting a growth, an uplift, but actually in reality it's going to hurt your company. It's going to bring your revenues down. But so those with the numbers of the power levels in online experiments, we do not come across them a lot. We do come across a lot of M-type errors, which is basically stating that every uplift is exaggerated. Every winning uplift is higher than it will be in reality. I'm not going into the details of the statistics behind it. Read my blog post on CXL. There's a link somewhere in the presentation. And let's assume that was 10% here. Then we're already a lot lower, right? 140% business case. Now comes Mr. Application. How do you create insights from this? And if you are a behavioral scientist, very often you will see winning experiments where you know that it's very likely that in the future it will backfire, right? So we come across sometimes across A/B tests where we're pretty sure that although the experiment was winning in the let's say the 4 weeks time slot that typically an A/B test runs, it'll backfire, be counter-effective in the long run. So looking at an experimental program, I'd like to emphasize that although we like the feeling of running lots of experiments and finding lots of winners, reality is more harsh on us, and we should be more humble towards our findings, because a situation like this is very typical. This is nothing out of the ordinary, right? This is what we come across at my company when I visit clients that are new. This is typically the situation. Over hundreds of experiments done, but only a couple of a dozen are probably real winners. In this case, not enough to actually have a positive business case. Also not something that never happens, right? I've come across that actually quite a few times already. All right, so that's the bad news. Is there anything we can do about that, right? Well, I think we should embrace the fact that these that there's this possibility to become more mature, because the worst thing you can do is stop testing. So although especially if you're new to the complexity of A/B testing, it's maybe not that easy to hear this, and tools are not helping you out here. The worst thing you can do is not testing, because even if you have if you would not test, then the ideas that you have that will actually hurt the growth of your company, that will bring you a loss, are also not challenged. So although my talk is more about finding winners and growing the company, not testing will also push live the losing experiments, the significant losers that would have prevented you from pushing something live. Now, oh wait, I'll just show you this one. This is a real case, very recent one of another client. They had 163 experiments. They were pretty mature, but when we reanalyzed their business case, right, they were assuming, again, on the assumption that a winner is effective for 6 months, that they were generating 20 million of extra revenue in 163 experiments. With our statistical recalculations, we got that down to 8 million, which is still good. I think it's very good. And an average value per experiment, whether it'll be losing in the end or winning, was 50,000 euros, which I think is an ideal situation, because an experiment usually does not cost 50,000 euros. This is definitely a company that should start scaling up their experimentation program. Now, what can we do to tackle these issues, and how can we make sure that the program is very, very effective? I'm gonna hook it to these 3 counselors, right? And I'll have like 5 tips for each one of them. So the first one is trustworthy data. If you do not do this already, please start checking for SRM errors. They can be very often explaining a winner or an insignificant experiment. I'll give you a very simple example. If the split is not 50-50 in your randomized controlled trial, there's something going wrong, right? Even a slight difference can already make a huge difference. But the easiest way to explain it is, let's say that repeat visitors have a higher conversion rate in your experiment on your platform, in your web shop. If more repeat visitors end up in, let's say, the variation instead of the control condition, naturally the average conversion rate in the variation will go up, right? And you might find a significant winner but it's not a real significant winner. There was no difference, right? Let's say it's an AA test. There's no difference, but because we have more repeat visitors by coincidence or by a bug in the variation, it'll be a winner. You have to check for that. There's a lot of posts on it. I have a link in the slides to a paper by Ronnie Kohavi from Microsoft, or used to be Microsoft. He's leaving. But we also created a SRM check module in our automated experiment analysis tool for Google Analytics. So if you're a Google Analytics user, use the top link. There's a Google spreadsheet where you can automate your testing analysis, including SRM checks. Second one, carryover effect. This mainly applies for people that build their own platform and that for the coin flip, use buckets that are reused for new tests. So if you're using all buckets, control and variation for a new test, stop doing that. There can be a huge influence of a carryover effect, that the effect of the previous experiment sort of extends into the new experiment. If you want to read more about it, again, a post by Microsoft under the more info link. Third one, sample dilution, cookie churn, other reasons why people are not recognized because let's say they switch device. There's an assumption behind A/B testing and the statistics in your tools, and one of the assumptions is that the control group and the treatment group are exclusive, right? There's no overlap. In A/B testing, that's never the case, right? If you have logged-in users, it can be the case, but on an open platform, usually people switch device or their cookies are deleted, and they're re-entering the experiment. 50% chance they end up in the wrong variation. So there are people that see both variations. You have to know how big the effect is on your platform, because if it's big, you cannot run long experiments, right? If by 4 weeks everyone has seen both A and B, there's no use in testing for 4 weeks. So, and there are easy ways like questionnaires, just asking people how often they visit the platform using how many devices. There are more advanced ways to see if cookies are being churned. But it is a serious issue. And the easiest way to tackle it is just shorter testing if you have high enough power levels to shorten your experiment. Very closely related is cookie clubbering. That's a term also coined by Microsoft. It's related to the fact that the variation, the treatment, is placing cookies that also might already affect the outcomes of the test, but this is really advanced. I wouldn't start with that one if you haven't tackled especially SRM checks yet. More info in the link again. And finally, of course, you want to prevent sampling data. So if you can get the data in chunks, for example, you're a Google Analytics user and you don't have 360, try to get the data in chunks, because sampling can, you don't know where the sampling is. It turns all your data into a black box and you're absolutely unsure about the trustworthiness of your data. And if you then have your raw data, please store it somewhere, because at some point later in the future, you will have new insights on the user behavior, and you have ideas like maybe this segment, let's say the repeat visitors, are reacting in this way. Maybe in the older experiments they were also reacting like that. You want to be able to check that. That's like a new experiment, which is the cheapest experiment you can do because you already did it. You're just going to dive into those segments based on a hypothesis. Just one picture of the picture is missing. There was a picture of our experiment analysis tool here. Just follow the link if you're a Google Analytics user, and then you can do your own SRM checks. Next one up is the evidence counselor. And the evidence counselor is basically a guy that is making sure that if you believe something is proven to be right, or an experiment is winning, is it actually a winner? This has everything to do with false positives, false negatives, right? Exaggerated uplifts, just read the text there. I have a calculator that will calculate your false discovery rate. So just fill in your number of tests, your thresholds for power and significance levels, and your winner ratio. And I'll give you an estimation in the FDR calculator. How many of your winners are actual winners and how many are false winners, right? And if you have any questions about me, find me on LinkedIn and I'll answer them. So false discovery, false negative, or non-discovery ratio, basically the same. M-type, please read the article. It's basically stating that the lower your power level, the higher the exaggeration of an uplift is. But that one is not for like a starter level. Very interesting is setting the optimal alpha. We all use a threshold of, let's say, 95%, of 90%, sometimes 80%. Why is that? Right? If you read this article behind the info link, you'll realize that finding a winner that is in reality not a winner is usually not so bad, because you're going to push the winner live. It'll cost you some time and effort and money to do that, but it's not that much money usually, right? Way worse is having an inconclusive outcome, which is false, which is actually a winner, right? It's like telling a pregnant woman that she's not pregnant. You have something that'll grow your company, but you're not going to give birth to it because the test is inconclusive. The fact that false negatives are so more important in e-commerce than false positives will balance out the threshold very differently compared to science. So read the article. You can do your own calculations or contact me if you want to calculate what is your optimal threshold. You can even do that for all the old experiments, and you will find more winners and or less false negatives, right? I hope some of you can follow me. I'm going to, since we had little time, I'm going to just skip these. I want to emphasize something that the evidence counselor is very, very strict in, and that is not all evidence is equal, right? An A/B test is a randomized controlled trial, and if done correctly, it's almost the highest thing you can achieve in science. You will not be more sure. The risk of your decision of whether it's wise or not to push it live is the highest you can get. The only thing higher is do a trillion of A/B tests and then do a meta-analysis, right? If you go down the hierarchy of evidence, as it's called in science, we call it the pyramid of validation, and we made it specific for digital types of studies. You first have the data layer. If you see, let's say, in cohort analysis or exploratory data analysis, evidence for a decision to go left or right, that's less good than an A/B test, but it's better than what users tell you, right? User research is almost the lowest level because people are just not aware of what drives their decision, right? If you do a lot of A/B tests and you analyze whether user research is bringing a lot of winners, usually, nope. Depends a bit on the situation, type of decision, etc., but it's less reliable, less valid than data analysis. And the worst is someone's opinion. This is where the hippos are, the highest paid person's opinions, the zebras, the zero evidence but really arrogant people, the lowest level. This is very helpful, right? If you have multiple types of evidence for a decision to put something live on your website, just take the highest one from this hierarchy. Just to show you whether user testing is useless testing, sometimes not, very often it is. This is the same client that I just showed a few slides ago. All the hypotheses that came from user research significantly lower the effectiveness of our testing program. It's better to leave them out, then we'll have a higher ROI, right? The average value of an experiment based on a hypothesis that was derived from the user experience lab at this client is a minus 10,000 euros. Right? If we have hypothesis based on data analysis, we have a pretty good one, right? 22,000. It's not the highest because there's a one more high, get to that later, but it's already a very positive one. All right, having said that, I'm going to the last one because time is up. I hope some of you are still there. Insights. I'd like to emphasize that a average uplift is average. There are lots of reasons to consider analyzing segments. And yes, you will have a likelihood of finding some segments that are just by statistical coincidence, but there's more and more statistics available to counter that. Again, heterogeneity, more info behind the link. It's very statistical. But of course, if basically, if you see the same segment react to the same hypothesis in a consistent way, there's something with this segment, right? And not with the whole population, which is very interesting from a learning perspective. Of course, you should archive all your experiments, including the hypothesis and all alternative explanations, because although you set a hypothesis for a winning experiment and it was a winner, it might still be that there's another reason why it was a winner, and it's not because of your hypothesis. So have all the possible explanations in there, and when you start building more and more experiments and more evidence, then you will see what were the most strong hypotheses. You need a hypothesis framework for that, and you need a good understanding of what drives human behavior. So it definitely helps to hire a consumer psychologist or follow a study, trying to catch up with the consumer psychologists you studied years, of course. And then the last one I want to emphasize before I start to sort of wrap it up is your own confirmation bias. We have an extreme confirmation bias. When we see data, when we see evidence, we very quickly see confirmations of our hypotheses, of our opinions, of our values, and it's very hard to counter that. But you have to, because otherwise you will, step in the trap of drawing conclusions which are actually not trustworthy. And I wanted to show you an example. I wanted to play a trick with you doing that, but I'm just going for the solution that we usually use. Again, apologies for the ugly images. If our CRO teams are setting up an hypothesis and they all agree, then the last one that's about to agree should disagree. And he should start finding other explanations. And we find this very, very helpful. If the team is all in line, yeah, that's a good hypothesis, or we see a winning test results, it'll be because of that reason. Then the last one just has to find other reasons. It's a nice practice in debating. It's a nice practice in being creative in finding other hypotheses. It'll bring you a bunch of new hypotheses, right? You will never run out of hypotheses, or never, at least for a long time, you will not. And you will be surprised how often actually another reason than when you thought, looking back after a year to all those experiments, was the reason for your winning experiments. So does that bring value? Here's an analysis of a client, the same client, 163 experiments, right? We checked in their data which experiments were not based on a hypothesis. They should stop doing that, at least for growth, because it has a negative impact on the program. Every ID, or a competitor has that, or a highest paid person's ID, is actually lowering the ROI of their program. They should still be testing this, but you have to categorize them separately, because maybe the ID of the hippo, the boss, was actually a really bad ID that would have brought loss, and you prevent that by testing it. But you should test that separately, because otherwise you will have more higher false discovery rate. Anyhow, if you are basing it on a solid hypothesis based on data analysis, there's a solid background behind the why, right? this client, they did 41 of those tests. Those had a positive impact. But then their center of excellence, which included behavioral scientists, two of them, who were basing their hypothesis on a scientific framework, they had the highest impact with an average value, compensated for all the things we mentioned, like false discoveries, etc. And they had an average value per test of 90,000 euros. But every test they start has an average value in the end of 90,000. Sometimes it's a winner, it's way more. Sometimes it's a loser, which is about 1/3, right? They have the highest winner ratio of all these three. And just wanted to show you that because it has a huge impact, right? So I hope that you realize that there's a lot to winning A/B tests. There's a lot to, was the data trustworthy? There's a lot to do about, are they true winners or false winners? Are they exaggerated, etc.? And there's a lot about, if it's a winner, what conclusions can we draw? And I hope you can get some ideas out of the presentation. I included a whole bunch of links if you want to dive deeper into any one of them. Again, apologies for the late start and late finish. And well, thank you for watching. I have two questions. And the first one is, what's SRM? SRM stands for sample ratio mismatch. So it basically means that in your sample data, right, all those people you're testing, there's a discrepancy between the control group and the treatment group. So your A and your B group, there's a difference, right? Either their size differs or segments within the groups differ. And if these segments differ, it's bad if the segments are also differing in, for example, conversion rate, if that's your metric. Okay? Because the more, that's SRM. I hope that's clear. And the other question is, sorry, I may have missed this. What types of data fall into the data-based evidence which you refer to in your hierarchy of evidence? Does this include things like analytics data, heat maps, etc.? Indiana, please find me on LinkedIn, because this is the very easy version of the hierarchy or the pyramid of validation. All exactly the types of CRO studies you're mentioning, heat mapping, but also surveys, scroll reach, are all in there and plotted in the hierarchy. The database, so the second layer, is really about big data sets and about especially cohort analysis. So you have upfront an hypothesis, and then you look to different cohorts that are different in these, like, are sort of control treatment group. It's not a randomized control group, but that's a very powerful way of looking at data, especially if you miss the power to run an experiment. But contact me, anyone else also, if you want to have the hierarchy with all the detailed studies plotted in how good the evidence is. Those were the questions. Thanks a lot for watching. Apologies for the slides and therefore for running late. Good luck with all the other speakers. They're amazing. Hope you have a good time at this optimization summit by Soho, PageSense, and in cooperation with CXL, which I both want to say thanks a lot for having me brag about all these nerdy aspects of our lovely CRO field and A/B testing. Thank you.